and apply them wherever you are. I know that not everybody on here is from California. So anyway, one of the things that we kind of forget, because roads are such a part of our human experience, is that this is really a unique agent in terms of wildlife's perspective on it. Roads are a totally novel type of situation to them. They are a new feature in the environment, and most species really have not adapted to any either roads or traffic, or they have sometimes had an adverse adaptation, such as going towards roads where they may get hit or otherwise. But if you look at some of these features of vehicles and roads, you see that there just isn't anything else that has all of these different impacts to wildlife in kind of in one vehicle. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at the impacts of roads to wildlife is whether it matters or not from a population level perspective, because as natural resource managers, we have to look at it from, what is this doing to the species or to the population rather than to the individual, even though as from a humane perspective, we may really feel bad about animals being hit on roads or something. But for managers, we have to look at these population level changes. Does it really matter, the impacts? And I'd like you to keep this in mind as you're going along and following me here. There's kind of three basic levels of impacts. One is the genetic interchange. That's the longest term one, and it really, you can do a lot to a population to separate them and so forth if there is some genetic interchange between populations over a fairly long period of time. Then there's the demographic rescue, or the demographic effects, where you want animals to be able to access all parts of their long and large scale habitat, so that you can repopulate unoccupied habitat and do these other things, especially when we think of climate change and how that is changing things at this point. And then kind of the lowest level is daily or seasonal movements, and these are the ones that where if individuals say can't get to water daily, or if they can't get to their breeding habitat on an annual basis, then there's going to be population level impacts if enough individuals are affected by it. So once you understand that scale of impact, then it will help you to identify if you do need to apply mitigation, or if so, what type of mitigation to apply. There's another one that I'm not going to talk much about today, and that's the safety aspect, because it's not as much of an issue with very small volume rural roads, and that is animal vehicle collisions where the drivers suffer. There are actually quite a few of them where the animals suffer, but not so much on a safety perspective. So here are some of the impacts from roads to wildlife that we'll be talking about today, and we'll go through each one of these. So I'm just basically listing them here, but as you can see, there's a pretty good sized list, and we'll be talking about them. So what are some of the characteristics of roads that do influence the level of impact? The first and most important one is proximity to good habitat. So if you have a road that really just goes through, something that no wildlife species of any type is going to live in, then, it really isn't going to cause any problems because there's nothing to impact. But this proximity to good habitat is dependent on what species that you're talking about. So recall that good habitat for one species is not necessarily good habitat for another, and vice versa. So it does depend on your management objective what the definition of good habitat is. And then the size of the road matters too. The width and how big the cut and fills are, that's very important. It's more important for some species than others. Traffic volume is incredibly important, and that is important both because of the type of use, whether it's, say, off-highway vehicles, logging trucks, whether it's commuters going back and forth, what time of the day they use the roads is very important. If they never go in at nighttime, that allows different effects, because essentially the nocturnal species are less affected than the diurnal species. For smaller roads, the speed of vehicles matters more than it does in say, paved highways. But it is definitely something that for smaller roads we want to pay attention to. Also, the higher the speed, the worse it is. But once you get up to highway speeds, it's kind of that sort of evens out, actually, because then there's nothing much you can do to change that. Road density is very, very important, and the type of density that occurs. So, for example, if you have a whole bunch of very, very tiny low volume roads, that can be an impact as much as having a highway and just, a very few smaller roads. So the type and configuration is important there, and that's also species specific. When a road is used, if it's only used in a season when the species that you're concerned with is not there, then there's not going to be as much impact as if, say, your heavily used roads are in the middle of, say, deer winter range during the winter. If you have a hard surface or a surface that has been heavily treated with dust abatement chemicals, then the surface type is going to be affecting particularly the smaller species like salamanders and frogs. Ability of the vehicles or the people to leave the road edge. So that will affect things, because development, like if it's very, very close to a town, then that, and I know we're talking about rural roads, but the closer you are to human development, the less that is going to matter. So we'll go through these, but keeping in mind that low versus high volume roads do have some differences, obviously, but the same type of impacts do apply. However, they're usually to different species, and that continuum goes from the impacts actually is additive from the lowest to the high volume roads. So all of the impacts that you have on low volume roads accumulate as your traffic volume increases, and that is one reason why it's important to know what traffic volume you have. Generally, however, low volume roads do affect the smaller species, and high volume roads affect all species. So be aware that what that implies is that as roads evolve over time, then the effects to different species are going to vary also. So what typically happens in the U.S. now is that we don't have a lot of new roads that are being developed, but we do have a lot of changes to the existing roads, and those roads are actually growing in traffic volume. They're changing in surface area, and this is kind of an evolution of roads from the lowest impact level, the smallest traffic volume, up to the highest. And we're not going to really talk about the last two because this doesn't apply solution. That's traffic volume. Is local roads. And in this case, these roads have effects to slow and wary species, so those wary species can be large species. But some of the mortality in these slow species can actually be substantial. For some toad species, it's been documented that we can find as much of as I'm seeing there's some voice issues here. Is this better now? I hope. Okay, I'll try to be really careful where my voice is hitting into the microphone here. I hope this is better. Okay, so for some small species, you can actually get a very large population hit. 10% of a population, even at 300 vehicles a day, is not sustainable. So don't think that just because you've got a small area that it doesn't necessarily matter. As you go up into the traffic volume, interestingly enough, these are the most lethal of the road stages. I see a question, what is ADT? That is average daily traffic. It's a measure of traffic volume. And the reason for this is because animals think that they can cross, but they can't make it through the gaps. And as it turns out, the majority of highways through our public lands are of this type. And then these two I'm just going to leave in here as the next two stages, but I'm not going to really talk about them, but they will be in the record anyway, or three stages. Okay, so the species groups that are at risk of those population level impacts that we talked about, some of them can be categorized as movement issues. For example, wide-ranging species that have to cross a number of roads, and this is where the road density is an issue, or where we have slow or immobilizing species that essentially have adaptations to predators that really don't work with, you know, if, for example, a porcupine is trying to keep a vehicle at bay by throwing quills at it, well, that's not going to work very well. So those species tend to be impacted. The second group of species could be characterized as habitat issues. And an example of that is those species who are actually attracted to the road for some reason. Snakes are a good example of this, where they are attracted to the road because of the thermal mass there, and they bask down in the the warm places, and so they can tend to be at risk of being run over there. And also those species that require dense cover. And these can be some little guys as well as some larger species. And what happens there is you've got a break in the cover as the road, because obviously the road is devoid of cover, and so you have some issues for them. They have they do not want to go out into the open, especially the smaller species, because they feel that they're going to be at risk of predation. Okay, so the next kind of general category would be those characterized as biological issues. And here's where it's interesting, because even very small roads can cause some behavioral changes with very large species such as grizzly bears, wolverines, black bears, elk. There are a number of species that exhibit that. And those species with a very low reproductive potential, which means that, for example, they live for a long time, but they don't have very many babies while they're doing it. And so therefore, if you kill some of the adults, it tends to be a very difficult to sustain situation. So and then when you combine something with low reproductive potential, like turtles with a high road density, then you have more opportunities for them to get hit on the road, and it can definitely cause some population level impacts. Okay, so we're going to talk about each of the impacts, and then go through some mitigation measures. The first impact we'll talk about is habitat loss. And if you think about how many roads you know about, this is just sort of a listing of the numbers, so to speak. We've got some 4 million miles of public highways in the United States. The vast majority of those are two-lane roads, and most of them that cause wildlife issues are two-lane rural roads. And then in addition to that, we have some 375,000 miles of roads on national forests. There's also other roads that I'm not counting here, and I don't have the number for that, but the amount of habitat loss that just the 4 million miles of public highways represents is equivalent to the size of habitat that is in South Carolina. And that's a big chunk of habitat that we've lost. So how does that work? Well, roads may be parallel to other built infrastructure such as power lines and railroads and various other things. They may actually physically alter the habitat. We may have invasive species that use the roadsides to either alter the habitat or reduce the habitat quality. And there will be, of course, we'll have a presentation on invasive species, so I'm going to talk very little about that. And then the footprint itself of the highway, small or large roads, extends to cuts and fills. And sometimes those can be far greater than the actual amount that cars travel on. You know, especially in steep country, the cuts and fills can be very substantial. Okay, so we have often used riparian areas to put our roads in, and some of that is because that's where humans as well as wildlife have always traveled, and to some extent it's an artifact of, you know, wanting our horses to have water while we're traveling, and then we put roads in those areas. But nevertheless, the result of that is that we have a habitat loss in sensitive habitats, and riparian habitats are really one of the absolutely most important for wildlife species, but we frequently put our roads right next to streams, and that results in a habitat loss in some of the most sensitive habitats that we have. And I mentioned the habitat loss from the footprint itself and the cuts and fills. This happens less in small roads, but it does happen. And the steeper the country, the more it happens. Okay, and that roads actually alter. What happens with habitat on, especially where water is involved? In this case, this actually was a road that a beaver put a dam in the culvert and then created a lake on one side. And in this case, as far as wildlife habitat, that's probably okay, but it also can affect other sensitive habitats. Maybe this would have been a meadow that had a rare plant or something. So it can be adverse as well as a positive thing. And all beaver dams are not positive for that matter either. But the point is that beavers or not, habitat alteration can occur because of the road prism itself. Oftentimes we have habitat damage by vehicles that access very sensitive habitats such as meadows, and that can happen from the road itself. I'm trying to get the pointer here. Okay, there it is. The pointer, the road itself can have that issue, or it can happen just because of people driving around once they get to the meadow. All right, the next impact is kind of two sides of the same coin, the barrier effect of roads and habitat fragmentation. And those are sometimes used sort of interchangeably, but they're not the same effect. A barrier effect can mean that animals are unable to get from one side of the road to the other. And that can happen. In this case, it's a highway. This is in Montana, US 93, and smaller species would have a difficult time. Obviously, fish would have a difficult time getting across the road, and that's a barrier effect. But it also is a habitat fragmentation effect because it literally, in this case, splits the habitat, and so the fragments of habitat that are left on either side may not be of adequate size or quality to be able to support the species that were there before that happened. There is a relationship in roads between the barrier effect and mortality and avoidance. So this graphic looks at what proportion of animals want to cross a road and which proportion of them turn around and do not attempt to cross because of the intimidation factor. And again, this isn't just highways. This can happen with very small roads as well. Then there's some of them that get killed while they're crossing. So that those two, both the avoidance and the killed animals, then do not make it across the road. And then there's a proportion that, of course, do make it across the road. But the barrier effect is part of both the avoidance and the mortality factor. And that is a species-specific effect, and it is strongly influenced by the amount of traffic on the road. Loss of habitat connectivity can, if we look at it from the term called permeability, that's the landscape's ability to allow an animal's free movement to all parts of its range, which is necessary. Remember, we talked about what is sometimes necessary on a daily or seasonal basis, where you may need to get, say, frogs to a breeding ground, or if you may need to get migratory deer from their summer range to their winter range. So if they're not able to make it across roads, or if they have to cross so many roads that it reduces their chances of successfully doing that, then the landscape definitely has a lower permeability, and it can affect a population. Interestingly, different species have different tolerances to roads, so they actually act as filters, and some species cross easily and some species do not. And you can actually find situations where you can change the area's species mix because of their ability to cross roads easier or not so easy. And that can affect predator-prey relationships and have some other issues as well. So how do roads affect that? They fragment the habitat. They can frighten or intimidate wildlife from crossing. The habitat loss from the footprint also makes a difference because some animals, for example, the dusky-footed wood rats that I showed earlier, they access easily. And then sometimes the roadway surface is inhospitable or intimidating, and that's, again, specifically true for smaller species. Okay, so here's a way of looking at road density that sometimes you don't think about, but it can be a whole bunch of different kinds of infrastructure. Power lines, highways, railroads in this case. These several linear features are in a distance of less than a quarter of a mile. So when you have any road density like this or linear infrastructure, then it's going to make it increasingly more difficult for several species to cross. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about vehicle-caused mortality. And this effect is specific to the species, and not only that, but to the population that we're looking at. And in some populations, mortality, while it's not nice to think about, again, from a humane perspective, but sometimes the population can handle it very well. In some cases, for example, if you think of raccoons, almost all raccoon populations can handle a lot of mortality without really causing any problems. But in some species, that's not the case. So, and in some areas, in some species, it's not the case. So what you want to do is talk to your people that know something about your local situation and have them help you to evaluate whether that is a population level effect or not. You do want to watch for those impacts to evolve as the smaller roads, say especially county roads that are being upgraded, are going into larger roads or have more traffic volume, and where they're crossing places where they're sensitive habitats. Those can really change very rapidly. And so just because something is not a problem in one year doesn't mean that it won't be in several other years. So looking ahead to see what is going to happen sometimes is pretty important. Generally, however, mortality impacts are more important for more species on higher volume roads. As the volume increases, the mortality issue increases for more species. The reason that I have the little western toadlet there, and he's very tiny, is because sometimes you can wipe out an entire season's productivity of these little toadlets because there are places that say, I've seen in one case where a road accessed a boat launch, and that was the only place on the lake that had toads that were coming out of, that were metamorphosizing and metamorphosing. And nearly everyone was getting squished, and that may be an issue, may not be an issue, but that's something to watch for. Mortality, however, can affect populations in some other ways. Snakes are actually a pretty good example of this because they tend to actually be attracted to roads. I mentioned that. And in some places in the country especially, they are actively targeted by drivers, and these can be in very, very tiny roads. There are studies that indicate that snake density in areas with high road density is much lower than the areas with low road density. And part of that is mortality, and part of it is an avoidance of the roads themselves, except for that basking situation. In other words, some snakes don't want to cross it, but they're willing to sit on it. And then also other species like turtles, because of their long-lived nature, if you lose very many of them, then you can affect the population. And again, road density, even of very small, low-volume roads, can make a difference in turtle populations. The next impact that I want to talk about is pollution. And we have several things that are more prevalent on small rural roads than we do on larger roads, and that is dust abatement. There's a number of different types of dust abatement. Sometimes it's salt, sometimes it's other chemicals, but because those chemicals can actually be absorbed into the skin of amphibians like salamanders and frogs and toads, they can cause mortality in that whole group of species. De-icing agents such as, well, there's a number of different kinds of de-icing agents, both salts and also physical de-icers such as cinders or the sand type of de-icing agents. In those cases, they sometimes are also mixed with salts. And between the de-icing agents and the dust abatement chemicals, you find that there are often a considerably higher proportion of toxic materials in the roadside area as opposed to the area that's away from the road. So those can actually not only cause direct mortality, but they can increase the barrier size of the road itself. So in other words, because it's lethal not only to cross the road, but also because of the collection of some of these chemicals outside of the road area, it can cause mortality there as well. And some of the exhaust components can accumulate. This isn't as big of an issue on low volume roads because obviously it's related to traffic volume. But sometimes you can find, well, let's say something like this isn't exactly exhaust components, but oil spills on logging landings and stuff. There can be some other polluting effects that can sometimes be quite substantial. And then stormwater can not only reduce water quality but it can also change the way that it flows into places, including the places that frogs and amphibians might be breeding. So that can very much be an issue. Here's a couple slides of a situation where de-icing agents, de-icing salts in this case, have been used for safety purposes. But in places where there's a lot of snow, we have flocks of what we call winter finches, which can be crossbills or siskins, and it's kind of a mixed flock of birds. But they actually are attracted to both the salt and the sand. The sand is something that they actually actively seek out. Unfortunately, once they ingest a certain amount of it, then what happens is that it is in a toxic level, and that makes them lethargic. And what happens then is that they get hit. And just because that they pick this up on they can pick up the salt and sand on small roads and then go to roads with higher traffic volume and still be lethargic. So it's kind of it's not necessarily an immediate effect as is shown here. Okay, another impact is, again, the kind of combined impacts of disturbance and increased human access, kind of two sides of the same coin again. And that can be exhibited in terms of noise because, of course, people are generally really noisy creatures. It can show up into access into sensitive areas where wary species of all sorts of taxa can be affected by it. It can increase legal harvest or poaching, and depending on the situation, those can be considerable problems. Sometimes the species that are affected by noise and human access are not necessarily the ones that you really would expect to occur. We have some new research that is indicating that spotted owls are actually having fewer young in areas that have rural roads with traffic on them. And these are roads that are like Forest Service, very tiny roads. And it is showing up in their productivity in the nests that are closest to the roads. Other species like trumpeter swans, which we don't have any in California, but that's another group that is really very sensitive to disturbance, and that can result in actually fewer young. And we don't want that for these two species because at least as examples of those species that can have reduced productivity, because these are species that we are actively trying to manage to increase their numbers. And let's see, then another couple of examples, bighorn sheep and surprisingly grouse are also affected by traffic volume. Even though grouse are on the smallest roads, we often see them picking up grit from the side of the road. But you may notice actually that you don't see grouse as the traffic gets higher. And that's because they are actually not using the habitat that's closest to the roads because it's too noisy. And so that actually reduces the amount of habitat that they have available. I've said several times that you can expect that most of the impacts from the smaller roads are from small species. However, there are large wary species such as grizzly bears and elk and wolverine that are affected greatly by even a very small amount of traffic. And then when you get on the other end of the size spectrum, such species as bats can be affected because they're very sensitive to human disturbance. And invasive species I'm not going to talk about much, but because we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But I would encourage you to think about both the invasive weeds, that is the invasive plants, which can really change the character of a habitat, and this is kudzu from the southeastern U.S., but there's also brown-headed cowbirds, which are invasive in some areas, and they are invasive on a smaller scale than, say, house sparrows or starlings, because they have been facilitated by roads going into more timbered areas, and in some cases they are now limiting populations for some species. I love this graphic because it shows really clearly how the invasive species started at the interchange on the left. And let me see if I can get the pointer to work here. Yeah, okay, started on the interchange on the left, followed along the interstate, and then ended up in this area, which is a habitat for a threatened species. This is in New York. There's a number of things to do. It's some of these things, unfortunately, are somewhat difficult to mitigate. We don't have perfect answers for them, but these are some of the things that have been tried successfully. Closing roads or gating them, or adjusting the seasons of use is a very, very common thing to do, and you can base that on what species you're trying to pay attention to manage. And then if you have sensitive areas that you know that no amount of use is going to be okay, then consider burying those areas, because sometimes it's just not possible to mix human use and wildlife acceptability. Ideally, if you can, decommissioning roads is actually better, because recall that road density is actually one of the characteristics that affects how species respond to roads. So by decommissioning roads that are not really useful any longer, then you reduce the road density, and that improves the size of the habitat that is left, and it also it decreases fragmentation. You can use limited operating periods so that you access certain areas only during those seasons when it actually has the least impact for the species that you are concerned about. Watch road density, I mentioned that, but this is also not only in decommissioning, but when we talk about the situations where we have roads that are actually being planned, we want to pay attention to what road density it is going to be now and in the future. Consider building roads away from sensitive habitats, and that's especially true with riparian systems, because so many species do depend on that. When you can, wildlife crossing structures can be added in a lot of places, even in tiny roads, because sometimes those smaller species do have trouble getting across the road. And lastly, in this page, don't forget to consider what's going to happen with the road in the future, 5 years in the future, 10 years, and 20, because roads typically grow, and they grow in volume, and I hope I've convinced you that as traffic volume increases, so does the impact. So take a long look ahead and try to understand what's going to happen here. Okay, human disturbance can be managed. In this case, there's a group of birders who want to see Kirtland's warblers, which are endangered, very tiny population, but this group has been guided, and so they're controlled. You know where they're going, and the person who is guiding them can control how close they get to the birds, and that really makes it a win for everybody. And of course, legal hunting is great. This is my good buddy Dave Romero, and he always gets in just a wonderful, beautiful animal during hunting season. We can manage the hunting through a number of different options, open and closed road systems, and gates and so forth are all options to do that. Consider wildlife crossing structures. In this case, I wanted to show on the top, and I'm going to try to get the pointer again here. Okay, down pointer. There we go. Okay, so this is a new bridge, and unfortunately, well, it replaced this culvert, which was not a good wildlife crossing or fish passage structure. The bridge is better in that regard, but because it's got the boulder armament all the way down into the water, it actually has been, unfortunately, a lot less useful for wildlife passage than it could be. So where you can, if you can allow some unsubmerged and unbouldered places so that animals can walk across, that's a much better situation. But wildlife crossing structures can be anything from very large bridges to tiny, relatively tiny pipes, depending on what species that you're looking at. And whenever you can, take advantage of opportunities that allow both wildlife and fish passage to occur. So in this case, these two pictures show the replacement of a undersized culvert with a bridge. And this bridge has a little bit of the issue of the little bit too much armament along the sides as well, but it is still a vastly better situation for hydrologic function, fish, and wildlife passage. In this case is a slotted drain culvert. What you can't see is that there is a culvert underneath this hole here, this line, and the line is actually access to air and moisture, and it helps improve the temperature as well. So this was designed for rattlesnakes to get across a relatively small road because they were getting hit. Temporary fencing sometimes is useful because it kind of buys you some time. In this case in Maryland, the silt fencing was keeping turtles off. This is a state park road, and they put together a grant that is funding turtle crossings, which would include a permanent fence, but it's actually not in the works yet. I mean, it has not been constructed yet, but in the meantime, the silt fence is actually working to keep turtles off the road, and the mortality has dramatically declined. And this is a fairly low volume road. I think it's in the well, I'm pretty sure it's under 400 vehicles per day. And road decommissioning, there's lots of ways to do this. The Forest Service is actively trying to decommission roads that it does not need. It's partly because we can't afford to maintain the roads that we have, but where we can get rid of the roads that we don't need, then decommissioning them does restore habitat, and we've learned how to do that pretty well. You can protect some sensitive habitats with barriers like boulders, and this really works very well for vehicles. It doesn't work as well for well, okay, vehicles that are larger, four-wheel, not so much for OHVs, but it does work very nicely. It does give the impression also that it's not okay to ride your vehicle all over these sensitive meadows, and that is a benefit as well. Some small roads can be really hugely impactful and cause all kinds of problems in addition to habitat loss. You've got some major drainage and water quality issues here. On the Hoosier National Forest in Indiana, this was a great project. They actually did a lot of regrading, and they moved the highway or road away from the stream a little bit, and so that actually solved the problem, but they also had to fix it. They had to make it back into, you know, something that was not going to turn into a creek again. And I think this is my last slide, pretty quick here, and this is a case where OHV damage was occurring in Colorado, and so what they were trying to do is to repair that along a stream. keep the sediment from going in. And of course, that's also going to eventually repair and replace some of the riparian habitat, which, as I mentioned, is really so valuable for so many species. Okay, so that's it. There's obviously lots more to this topic, but that's all I've got for this morning. So I'll take your questions.